Today we're going to get into Chapter 8, which is Wireless Vulnerability. Our learning objective for this chapter is to analyze vulnerabilities that get exploited by hackers, specifically some physical vulnerabilities in wireless technology. So our key concepts are going to be wireless security and tech. Bluetooth in particular we're going to talk about quite a bit. Threats to wireless networks, some different tools we might encounter, and then how to countermeasure these things and protect the networks that we are responsible for. So wireless signals travel through the air where they are easily picked up by wireless devices. Essentially, the electromagnetic frequencies that are being transmitted get picked up by a specific resonating antenna in the receiving device, and then they are able to transmit back. So radio frequency can be affected by a lot of stuff. Atmospheric conditions, building materials, nearby devices. If you've ever used like an old school tape deck or a certain type of microphone, you hear kind of a hum. That could be that you're too close to a particular device that might be causing interference. Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are common in notebooks, tablets, smartphones, pretty much any kind of smart appliance or device. Nowadays, Bluetooth really kind of became popular around the same time that the majority of most people got into Wi-Fi, which was the late 90s, early 2000s. Specifically, Wi-Fi was trademarked by the Wi-Fi Alliance in 1999. Now, the reason that this trademark was placed is because we wanted to make sure, as a scientific community and a technological community, that if any product bore this logo, that it had compliance testing, and it made a certain level of conformity to the different standards that existed. Now, as we will see, we talk a little bit later on, 802.11 has a broad number of variants. So this means that on occasion we will see things that do not seem to fit. So that means that not all 802.11 devices are considered Wi-Fi standard. It may be that they have not undergone testing, or they are in some way, shape, or form out of spec. Some terminology I would like you to have for this chapter would be things like GSM, Global System for Mobile Networks, or mobile communication, depending on the definition. So if you have a cell phone with T-Mobile or with AT&T, it's going to be a GSM device. Prior to their acquisition by T-Mobile, Sprint was a CDMA carrier, as is Verizon. Now, this is more of a baseband frequency thing. So if you hear about LTE or 5G ultra capacity like you see, those are things that are advancements on the baseband. Bandwidth is the theoretical maximum of information that can be carried over a medium. So if we're talking about transmitting over copper line, it is the difference between the maximum and minimum frequencies that can be registered on the device. So if we take the maximum minus the minimum, that is the width of the frequency band that is supported, hence bandwidth. Access point, or AP, is how we connect a wireless device to a backbone network. When we look at WiMAX in a little bit, we'll see what's called a backhaul and how that is going to allow you to bridge a wireless segment of the network into the main wired backbone. BSSID, Basic Service Set Identifier. This is a MAC address of an AP with BSS active, the basic service set of the device. So this is very close to an SSID, or service set identifier, which is the name of the network that we would be used to see. And see service set identifier from the right-hand column. ISM band, this is a specific set of frequencies that are commonly used by the industrial, scientific, and medical industries. Hotspot, it's a place where wireless networks are publicly available. So if you go over to Barnes & Noble or your local cell phone provider, if you go to the T-Mobile store or the Verizon store, you will have a local Wi-Fi network so that you can test out products, things like that. Association, this is the process of linking an access point to a wireless device. So when you tap on the link for whatever your wireless network is, and you enter your passphrase or whatever it may be, whatever your authentication method is, that is associating your particular wireless device to that particular AP. Now, certain APs, when they're built in an ESS or extended service set cluster, allow you to stay in the same Wi-Fi network using a number of different APs. So here on campus at Wake Tech, as you're walking through, as you move through the building, you're not staying on the same AP. So this is going to be an ESS level association to where you're able to transition from AP to AP as part of the same network. Service set identifier, we already talked about the BSS ID. OFDM, this one's a little bit more complex, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. Now, multiplexing, I don't believe we've really discussed in depth before, but this is the idea that we are going to have multiple data streams inside of the same transmission. So it's an encode method for multiple frequencies to be able to be transmitted over the same medium simultaneously. So if you have a Spectrum, for instance, and you get home TV and home phone and home internet, those all come across the same wire to come into your house. There's a big, thick, RG6 coax that joins into a junction box at your house, and then that feeds up into the infrastructure of your wiring. And at some point in the house, there's a dedicated line that has an amplifier on it, and it connects to your cable modem. That cable modem is able to process information for your home phone by filtering out the VoIP signals, and then it's able to filter out the data that can be passed to either a hard line or to a wireless device. And then you have your television signal, which comes out and is translated by your cable box, or if you have a cable card ready television. We also have MIMO OFDM, multiple input, multiple output, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. So this is an interface for 4G/5G broadband. This is where we're able to process using multiple antennas simultaneously to enhance the bandwidth of the system. This is something in technology that I think we took far too long to be able to introduce, which was the idea of, instead of having this one big, crazy, impressive antenna that sucked in all this data, if you have multiple smaller antennas across a device, it's much more likely that the sensor system is going to be able to accurately process the inputs from the wireless network around it. So that's why you have devices that have these what I call soap bar antennas that go around the rim of their frame and connect at multiple points. It allows us to be able to take in information much more effectively. The last two, DSSS and FHSS. The SS stands for spread spectrum, and both of them at the end. You have what's called direct sequence and frequency hop. With direct sequence, you have the original signal, but it gets multiplied with pseudo-random noise to spread the data apart. So that way it's harder for people to try and crack into it. With frequency hop, this is a radio transmission method that was, I believe, originally credited to Grace Hopper. It's funny because you think frequency hopping, and her last name was Hopper. It was very interesting. We're going to rapidly switch among multiple channels in order to, based on a pseudo-random algorithm, make it harder to predict where we're going to have that continuity of contact. So, as I said a little bit ago, we're going to have some variations. Wireless technology has been around for a number of years. I mean, for those of you who are in this program now, who are not non-traditional students, you're coming straight out of high school, things like that, Wi-Fi has largely always existed for you. But I remember when it was first really kind of a thing, and the antennas were really bulky, and like the first laptop that I had that had Wi-Fi had a PCMCIA card, which is like it almost looks like a paper check, or like a slightly longer version of a dollar bill. And it would slot into this rectangular slot on the side of my laptop, and it was very awkward. And I definitely cracked off part of the casing one time when I forgot to take it out when I put it in my laptop bag. Now, with 802.11, the first standard that saw major usage outside of custom deployments was 802.11a and b. Now, A was basically, it's slightly faster, but the range coverage and the stability was not great, so B came in very, very quickly. 802.11a was used by large companies or educational institutions that could afford the equipment, that could afford the training, and then could handle the implementation. Performance was increased significantly with B, and it was much easier to adopt. It was much more widely adopted, in no small part to the fact that A had kind of forged the path ahead. 802.11g eventually came in, and this combined the best of A and B at the time, where you had a higher bandwidth as well as the 2.4 gigahertz frequency that gave you a much longer range comparatively. The successor to G is 802.11n, and this is where we brought MIMO into play, multiple input, multiple output. So if you have like a Nighthawk router and it has like 4 or 6 antennas on it, that is a MIMO facilitation standard. 802.11ac, which at the time of our text was the newest standard available, so it's a little bit out of date. It's about 2 years out. We have Wi-Fi 6 now and getting ready to migrate to Wi-Fi 7. We have significant amounts of increase in speed and reliability. We have things that run in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands at the same time. I want to point out 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. We notice that they're not direct multiples of one another, and that's by design. Because what you don't want to have happen are these inflection points where the frequency bands would overlap and create harmonics. This means that you would get interference. So if we multiply and we overlap these bands at 2.4 to 4.8, that means we're not going to hit the 5 gigahertz range. And then if we go above it again and we go to 7.2, we're again not hitting anything like that. So it makes it much more unlikely that we're going to have these collisions with these two bands running simultaneously. And there are other variants as well. There's continual improvements going on. And if you go into Google or your favorite search engine and type in IEEE 802.11 standard variants, you'll see the evolution of how do we handle X or Y frequency, what do we do with bandwidth, compatibility, technical data rate, extended data rates. And they're in review because the IEEE is based on consensus. We want to provide an agreement for how these things are supposed to be implemented. Now, if you look at the graphic on your right, you're going to see some different types of wireless networks that will implement some of the technologies that I was telling you about. So you can see here that you have in the top left, you've got an access point that's connected to a hardline broadband router, and then you've also got an extension point. So you've got users that can connect in either via a hardline or via Wi-Fi within the given radius. Multiple access points, which is not the same thing as an extension point, but you do have that shared ESS or extended service set. LAN-to-LAN wireless network, where you can have two routers that can communicate with each other, usually through bridging of some kind. And then you can see in the bottom right, we have the hotspot. Now, obviously, 3G has been largely decommissioned. That's still something in process. 4G is still present, of course, 5G being the more modern standard. And we'll see that evolve again and again over time. WiMAX. This is a technology you're going to see a lot less of, unfortunately. This was something that we saw around Greensboro for a little while here in the Carolinas through Sprint. This was a what was called last mile access. So essentially, certain users that were in semi-rural or in certain areas that didn't have the same infrastructure development, they might not be able to get access, like for somebody who lives on a farm, things like that. Somebody who's got like a half-mile long driveway or something similar. That can be difficult because you've got, a lot of cable that has to be run just for your particular location. So for them to be able to have internet, they would have to pull out a trencher, dig a trench along the line, be able to run, coax conduit all the way up to the building, be able to put in the junction boxes, be able to put up the connector poles, and then be able to hook it into the main backbone further towards, the main highway or whatever it is that's there. Very, very cost prohibitive. I had a friend when I was living in Winston-Salem who worked with me, and his family was looking at getting, high-speed internet, and this was around 2006, 2007, and they wanted to be able to run the conduit, run the trencher, get everything set up, about $50,000. Pretty insane. Now, obviously, there would be some credits on that because it wasn't like they were on a farm. That was the line just for them. It was actually for their neighborhood. Because they were further back than just the corner of that particular road, it would actually benefit a number of other customers. But it was still a pretty extensive amount of money, and they weren't even willing to diminish that significantly if they were willing to get out there and run the trencher themselves. Because my friend Andrew, his dad was a general contractor. He had a lot of that equipment already. So it's not designed for use with local area networks. It's meant for just bridging the gap between the end of an ISP's range and an interface between that and a
metropolitan area network technology, which means that it's improving a wider range of coverage, but it is not a wide area network in and of itself. So you can see in the graphic there, we go from the ISP to some, basic endpoint. Then you have a transmitter that gives you a line of sight transmit to what's called a backhaul, and that allows you to say that this is your back end range that you have access to. And then you have a non-line of sight radial transmission that goes to those home users. Much easier to set up, much easier to maintain, a lot less physical effort in order to install. Like I said, unfortunately, you're not going to see it as much. The reason I say unfortunately is because it's a lot better in terms of stability for areas that might otherwise only be serviced by things like dial-up or satellite. Bluetooth, we're going to talk a lot about Bluetooth. It's a short-range networking technology that pairs devices. And we got a couple of different form factors for that. We're going to break it into two for the most part. Connections allow traffic over no more than 10 meters with low bandwidth requirements, so it's pretty easy to be able to send information to and from. It is what's called a PAN, a personal area network. This is tech that allows devices to connect to things like accessories. With standard Bluetooth, we can stream rather rich content, stuff that requires slightly more bandwidth than just a yes, no, off, on sort of thing. Bluetooth Low Energy, which was an extension of the ANT Plus protocol with Bluetooth tech, requires much less energy to operate and it sends very small bits of data. It doesn't require device pairing, which is something that is required for standard Bluetooth. So if you have something like a key fob that needs to be able to send a lock or ignition command or things like that, Bluetooth Low Energy is great. If you need to send something like audio or printout, that's going to need much more bandwidth, so classic Bluetooth would be the better option. Bluetooth version in the 90s didn't really gain a lot of popularity until, as I said, with Wi-Fi, late 90s, early 2000s. That's really where it started gaining commercial acceptance, not necessarily industrial applications. Very flexible. It's useful to link devices wirelessly. Has some issues with security. If we look over here at the application stack and things like that, you can see that there are some potential gaps that could be there. But it does do a fairly good job of supporting remediation techniques. So, of course, we have a ton of different implementations to where you can have wireless mice and keyboards that you didn't want to necessarily use infrared or a big, big gross dongle that you have to attach to your computer. It's this big blob of plastic. GPS attachments, barcode scanners, supplement for USB. My wireless mouse at home has two settings. It can go either at 2.4 gigahertz using a very low profile USB dongle, or it can go through Bluetooth, which is really handy because Bluetooth transmitters can then be multi-point. With my headset for my laptop, I have a set of earbuds. Those can work through Bluetooth with my laptop as well. My mouse can work, and then I can connect to any number of different devices as well, depending on the standard and profile that's loaded. Replacement for infrared, for things like remotes. So I'm trying to remember whether or not the Xbox uses Wi-Fi or Bluetooth for their controllers now. It used to be they used RF, radio frequency, so their range was slightly more limited. But now I believe they either use Bluetooth pairing or Wi-Fi based pairing. I think it's Bluetooth to be able to make it much more secure to where you can have multiple profiles working together and you don't have as much potential crosstalk. And you can use things like wireless remotes, like for televisions, for projectors, all kinds of stuff. So there's a lot of different implementations there. Now, an important thing to understand about Bluetooth is part of the security stack that we've talked about that has some flaws on it, also has some remediations. So one of the things we want to be aware of is a trusted device. A trusted device can exchange data without asking for permission. So that means that we say, connecting to my Bluetooth headset, I can, give it the okay to be able to just continue sending where I don't have to keep, giving it the okay. A personal device like your phone or laptop or tablet, that's a trusted device when connecting to a particular source, whatever it may be. You can also think about things like company devices. So if you have a printer, like a print center in your local office, you may want to allow access to that on a consistent basis as opposed to having to connect to it manually each time.
Now, again, you want to make sure that the vetting process that you would use would be the same for anything else. You don't want to connect stuff to your computer that doesn't actually have need to know access, if you will. Discoverability. This is a mode that can be set. Allows your device to be seen by other Bluetooth devices in range. Now, this is both good and bad. Visibility, ease of connection means that we can link things together very fast and be able to dynamically adjust that connection as needed. But if we don't have something to verify the identity of the devices in question, then we can have potential breaches. So attackers can clonk onto your device and be able to steal your data. We'll talk about some of those attacks in a moment. So unless you are actively connecting to something, it is my recommendation that you leave your device in non-discoverable mode. Now, some of the different attacks that we see with Bluetooth tend to start with the word blue, because we're a creative bunch in technology. Blue jacking, blue snarfing, blue bugging, blue smacking. Blue jacking, I've actually listed the steps. So if you have like an Android phone or something you'd like to use with, you can actually test this out. So if you go into an area where you have kind of the ability to observe these interactions, go into your contacts, create a new contact, enter the message into the name field, save the contact, and then send via Bluetooth for any device within range. And then you go ahead and send card sent. They get a little message that pops up, and they have the message in the name field, so it's automatically going to be a message that shows up on screen. Now, this may not sound all that weird, but it can be, again, it's just a way of being able to obscure one's identity in a public place. So it's an interesting type of attack. Blue snarfing is just trying to grab data from a Bluetooth device. So this is like pod slurping, but through a Bluetooth connection. Blue bugging, which is where we use a device for essentially surveillance. We're trying to capture information from the audio or from text messages, things like that. And then blue smacking is a DOS attack, and it overflows a Bluetooth device with random packets. So what are some best practices? Well, if you have the ability to set your PIN for your Bluetooth device, use non-regular patterns wherever possible. Keep Bluetooth devices as non-discoverable, as we talked about just a little bit ago. Do not accept any unknown or unexpected pairing requests. It's weird, human beings reflexively will try and click through certain types of message, so people will take that into account and design their messages so that, it almost has like a double negative quality. Always use encryption if you're pairing a Bluetooth device to a PC, wherever you can possibly do so. Only turn on Bluetooth when you need to. And make sure that your devices have some form of antivirus software. It's really strange to think about because a lot of the devices that you use with Bluetooth traditionally aren't well known for having antivirus capability. But things like your phone. People don't think about having wireless security on their phone through a form of antivirus or anti-malware, but it is definitely something that one must consider. Bluetooth technology is designed to incorporate security measures, so it's just a matter of getting the one that fits the situation in which you are finding yourself. Now, the presence of security doesn't mean that it's used. It doesn't mean that it's used appropriately. It doesn't mean it's used at all. So owners and administrators should always review their options and evaluate how they apply to the situation at hand. Viruses, malware, all kinds of other intrusive attacks that are not human agents. Viruses leverage the discoverability feature of Bluetooth to be able to locate and infect other nearby devices, so kind of taking advantage of some of the attacks that I just mentioned. Mobile malware is very, very lucrative, and traditional PC software like Malwarebytes or Norton have mobile versions. I know Kaspersky, McAfee, AVG. So Bluetooth makers provide tools to use the technology safely, but it has to be something that is in the control of the end user. So, discoverability, things like that, you have to take control of those choices in order to appropriately secure your system. Well, let's talk about wireless LANs just a little bit. There's CSMA CD versus CSMA CA, collision detection versus collision avoidance. In networks based on 802.3, which is the wired Ethernet standard, Ethernet 2, stations move information
automation with collision detection because we can see technically the whole network. We can see where collisions occur. We're talking about wireless networks based on 802.11. That's collision avoidance, and that's traditionally kind of like when you first learn how to drive and you peep out at a stoplight or a stop sign. Excuse me, not a stoplight. Wait till it turns green. You wait. You make sure you wear your seatbelt and you wait for that light to turn green. Go dad mode for a second. But a stop sign, excuse me, where it's much more discretionary. You're kind of leaning forward over your steering wheel a little bit, making sure nobody's coming before you move. And that's much more what a CSMA CA is actually producing. In a wireless LAN, the access point allows us to have a connection between the wired and wireless sections of our infrastructure. The SSID allows us to identify our network. That can be spoofed, so we want to make sure we're cautious. AP association allows us to connect a client to an AP that is pre-configured for the network it's supposed to be attaching to. Before we can connect to an account, we have to connect to the physical interface through wireless transmission. Radius. Radius is one we'll talk about in a little bit. It's authentication, specifically remote authentication, dial-in user services. It helps to be able to offload authentication of wireless users from the AP itself and provides an additional layer of security in the absence of wiring. We also use it to centralize AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting, way that we can kind of keep track of what's going on with wireless connectivity and data transmissions. Now, when we're setting up a wireless LAN, we've got two primary options. We've got ad hoc and infrastructure. Ad hoc is where the clients are talking to each other directly. It's peer-to-peer. There are certain types of mesh networks that are structured in this way. I personally don't like using those unless I have to because they tend to be a little bit unreliable, and computationally speaking, they're a little bit more aggressive than are necessary. Infrastructure is better if you have the ability to set this up where you have a centralized device that everybody associates to. So if you have a LAN party that you're putting together, in a standard LAN party, you would have like a hub or a switch that everybody links into. If you're doing wireless, then you're going to have a wireless AP. Sometimes you'll have a device that does both. You'll have a multifunction router that has routing, switching, and AP capability built in. Now, authentication with Wi-Fi tends to take two different forms, depending on whether or not you're using an open system or a shared key. With an open system, you do a probe request, probe response, authentication request and response, and then association request and response. So you've got three call and response setups to go between the client and the AP. With a shared key process, you have an authentication request and a challenge. You encrypt the challenge text and send it back. You decrypt the challenge text, and if it's correct, authenticates the client and then allows them to link in. So you've got some slightly different featuring there. You'll notice with certain types of protocols, we'll talk about CHAP and things like that in a bit. Challenge-based authentication versus just standard open authentication is always going to give us some different potentials for reducing overhead, making things a little bit more streamlined, or potentially leaving us vulnerable to an open accessibility form that could mean somebody could breach. Very, very simple. If we have a centralized authentication method, then it looks a little bit more like this. Instead of having just the client and the access point, and that's the only point at which the access point is really making the decisions for us, we instead involve a radius server or similar, things like Kerberos or what have you. So we have our step process here expanded a bit, it's going from 6 steps to about 8. We do a call and response to where the client requests a connection, the access point bounces back an EAP request to figure out who they are. They do an EAP response, and then that gets forwarded to the radius server. The radius server is then able to say, okay, based on this response, I'm going to go ahead and send a request to the client via the AP. I'm going to specify our connection mechanism. So instead of going through the AP and having the AP do any kind of decision making, it's going to use that as a conduit for direct connection. Step 6, we've got the client responding to the radius server with its credentials, again via the AP, using it as a pipeline. And then based on the credentials, if it's acceptable or not acceptable, we're going to send a notable response. We're going to send an encrypted communication key to be able to link them in. And then we have what's called a global auth key that's encrypted with a unicast per station session key. So these keys are going to be generated based on a global auth, but they are going You'll notice here that, even though we're only adding 2 steps or so, the authentication process is much more involved because we have a third device that's being used to say, is this accurate? Is this not accurate? Now, of course, for those of you who are a little bit more security minded, you're like, hey, what if I compromise the access point, or if I snarf information that's coming off of that, if I'm capturing packets? Yes, that is, of course, an issue. We don't talk about encryption at the access point there, so we have to talk about association before authentication. Brings back what we were talking about just a moment ago. Some different threats and countermeasures, of course. Threats come in 5 main categories: access control, integrity attack, confidentiality attack, availability attack, and authentication attacks. So, of course, we go back to the triad, right? We've got the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then we have our 2 extra tenets. So with access control, one of the big problems we run into is war driving. This is where an attacker moves through an area trying to detect wireless APs or similar devices. We have similar attacks called war walking, biking, flying, and droning, just doing the same thing. We're trying to canvass an area to see if we can find some open APs or some APs that are going to be easier to try and breach. Rogue APs, these are installed without authorization. They bypass organizational security controls, leaving them unmanaged, unknown, and unsecured. Not intrinsically malicious, it just means that we have a situation where an AP is not directly under the control of the administrator of the network. Mac spoofing, of course. Misconfigured security settings. Most consumer-grade devices are pre-configured for convenience and not for security. And we've already talked about the inversely proportional relationship of security and convenience. As security goes up, convenience goes down. That does not mean that as convenience goes up, security goes down in every case. It just means that convenience means that we are sacrificing some measure of security for functionality. But if something is hard to use, then it doesn't mean that we have a more secure system. It just means sometimes we have crappy design. All networks should be configured properly. Never use defaults. Make sure that if you have the option to check the box that says validate settings on exit, like you do for IP addresses in Windows, use it. Test your settings. Make sure everything's working normally. If anything seems janky or kind of weird, just take a look. Unsecured connections. This is a thing that happens. It's frighteningly common. Transmitting data over an unsecured access point or unsecured segment can be problematic. Any users who leave wireless technologies like Bluetooth enabled on a notebook or mobile device may be open to data theft, may be open to other types of intrusion. So always be aware of whether or not something's turned on. Kind of like with webcams, most people have like a piece of tape or something they put on there. A lot of newer cameras will actually have a slide that you can put over the front of your cam to make it obstructed directly. Same thing with Bluetooth. You want to make sure that if you have the option, just go ahead and turn off the functionality altogether. With Windows and iOS, I know in particular, I'm sorry, not Windows, Android and iOS, you can pull down the shade, the notification shade, and be able to tap on the Bluetooth icon and just disable it completely. So familiarize yourself with how to do that. Keep yourself safe. Promiscuous clients. Promiscuous clients are APs that are configured to offer strong signals in the offer of good performance, but they are taking in all data from systems that they are connected to. So promiscuous clients can cause data sniffing to be much more effective for an attacker. With integrity-based attacks, traditionally that's where we're talking about viruses. They replicate and use network resources to jump from system to system. They have things like frame injections, replay attacks, being able to manipulate IVs or radius tickets, things like that. And then confidentiality attacks would be things like eavesdropping or WEP cracking. WEP is very much out of date, but it is still something you'll see on occasion, which is really disappointing. But unfortunately, that is the cross we have to bear as security professionals. We want to make sure that we instruct people that just because it's a encryption technology that's out there doesn't necessarily mean it's good or useful. The evil twin AP, where somebody has an AP that's impersonating something that would be a legitimate service, man-in-the-middle attacks. So, of course, then our countermeasures would be things like firewalls, filtering rules, antivirus, virtual private networks, training, something that is criminally undervalued, to where
people who are working in certain agencies or certain divisions of certain companies should be well aware that they are considered to be high priority targets. And they may not necessarily think about it, but the data that they have access to in the normal course of their duties may make them more susceptible to somebody just trying things out and seeing if they can get a bit of information from them. And then IPSEC, of course, IP security. We want to make sure we enforce that wherever possible. An extension of this that we see in the modern era that people don't really think of as being a potential avenue for intrusion is the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is a network of devices that are connected via wired and wireless networking. Devices on the network can be accessible worldwide, so you have direct global interface access points on your local home network, and it can be devices that you interact with every day. So these devices can then be used, very much like a rogue AP or similar, to penetrate a personal or corporate network, or the device can be compromised itself. You can have flashing to be able to rewrite the firmware to change the security options or be able to capture data that it wasn't intended originally. Some different devices that we might see would be things like lights, smart bulbs, thermostats, refrigerators, home entertainment systems, security systems, all kinds of sensors, environmentals, vehicles, wearables such as watches, glasses, medical devices, exercise monitors. A lot of people don't think about how to secure these things. So we always want to make sure that, if you're going to have a global interface for something that's accessible outside of your home or outside of your corporate environment, that you have some regulation over how data passes to and from. If you're going to have a light bulb that is able to be remotely controlled, you don't want it to be that somebody's able to remotely control those lights and either lock them out or turn them on at inappropriate times and run up your power bill or burn them out, things like that. Because all these things they're pivot points into your network. So if you don't secure them, something that's inconsequential, like a light bulb, in very general terms, becomes something that is extremely consequential, like your main data server or your email server. Some different tools that we might see would be things like Kismet. It's a layer 2 sniffer IDS detector. It does a lot of passive collection. NetStumbler, NetSurveyor. Surveyor grabs info about APs. Medieval Bluetooth Scanner, Steel Central, SSIDer, Core Impact, GFI LandGuard, CowPatty, OmniPeak, AirCrack. AirCrack is huge. We'll dig into that in just a minute. Wireshark, very common sniffer we've already worked with. Wi-Fi Pineapples, Ubertooth One, which is a Bluetooth intrusion device, and then CAPSA, Portable Network Analyzer. Cannot say enough good things about Colasoft, and that's what CAPSA comes from. They have Packet Crafter and a couple of other things that I've used over the years. Very, very handy sets of equipment that they provide. So, most of these tools I have personally worked with. Some of them I pulled from the text. All good ones to be aware of. So here's the interfaces for NetStumbler and SSIDer. NetStumbler is great for being able to locate networks within range, something that's very commonly used for war driving. More often than not now you'll see people using Weigel or things like that. It's not currently being updated and doesn't officially support newer wireless protocols, but I believe there's a GitHub fork with newer updates of it. SSIDer uses the native Wi-Fi application programming API. It does work with the latest protocols, again, because it has a little bit more of an independent development process. And it gives you the strength of signals using dBm, which is a measurement of decibels over time, and based on the meters of distance for triangulation. And it can very easily export the data that's given in Wi-Fi and GPS format into something that can be viewed in Google Earth or a similar interface. It uses what's called KML, the keyhole markup language. Now, as I said, AirCrack NG is a very involved software suite. Now, some of these modules may not be present anymore, depending on the iteration that you pick up, but these are all ones that I've used over time. So we've got things for cracking, we've got things for decryption, we've got things for what mode your NIC is going to be placed into, being able to do
packet injection, traffic generation, tons of different conversion tools, especially for working with IVs for different encryption standards. IV stands for initialization vector. Um, you can create, ad hoc AP interfaces to be able to try and capture local traffic, decloaking WEP content. WEP has been cracked up one side and down the other, so that's not a good target, but it is still something that's out there on occasion. Being able to manipulate frames for TKIP-based networks. We'll talk about TKIP in a little bit. So lots of stuff with Aircrack NG. If you haven't gotten a chance to look at it, definitely do so. A lot of things in there. Very comfortable command line interface. Lots of capabilities for scripting with manipulation of wireless networks. MAC spoofing. This is where we're trying to imitate the MAC of an authorized user to bypass MAC filtering. MAC filtering is where, of course, we have the network interface says I'm only going to accept information from this particular either MAC or range of MACs because those have been vetted and verified and already added to the network. In this case, it can, in software at least, try and imitate the value that would be returned by IP or IF config to a different hex value. So as you can see in the graphic here on the left, you can see what the original MAC address is and then what the output MAC address is, going from a VMware interface to a Nokia interface. You can set it as random, you can change it to a specific one. It's definite, there's some definitely questionable implementations of this tool, but it is one that it gets used quite a bit. So, of course, when we're dealing with wireless networks, we always want to be aware of what the current state of affairs is for certain technologies. We never want to use the defaults. Make sure your AP is placed in an area that is going to be functional, but not cover areas that you don't want to secure. Yagi or certain types of dipole antennas use directional interfaces in order to limit the range of coverage. You can also adjust the output wattage of your transmitter to see that it only covers a particular physical area. Then again, education. Make sure that employees know that if you install a rogue AP, it's traditionally not going to be a great time for everybody. Use protection for transmitted data. Don't use WEP. I listed WEP so that you know it's there, but I want you to know, do not use it. It has been cracked for a very long time. It is not considered an acceptable encryption standard. In modern Windows systems, a cracked standard is worse than no encryption at all because there are certain internal controls that get relaxed whenever Windows believes that there's an encryption standard present. WPA, WPA 2 and 3. WPA has largely been broken, so stick to 2 and 3. 2 is okay, 3 is preferred, but not all devices will support it. And then, of course, use MAC filtering where you can. We just saw, though, it's pretty easy to get around that. And again, it's all deterrence. CRC32, 24-bit IVs on WEP. WPA uses TKIP, which is Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, and MIC, Message Integrity Check, in order to provide stronger encryption. PSK is vulnerable to eavesdropping and packet spoofing. WPA2 really is where the muscle starts coming in because we involve AES, our Advanced Encryption Standard, and then CCMP, which we'll talk about in a little bit. WPA2 Enterprise also integrates EAP standards. WPA3 gives us GCMP 256 as well as HMAC SHA 384. Widespread support is patchy for WPA3, so just keep your eye out for that. For those who are curious, GCMP is Galois counter mode protocol, and HMAC is hash-based message authentication code. HMAC trades off the need for a complex PKI and delegates key exchange just to the parties that are involved in the communication. And then SHA, of course, we talked about is it's a hashing algorithm. So when we look at WEP versus WPA, one of the major changes we can see if we look right underneath where you see the RC4 cipher, I'd say about 30-40% from the left-hand side of the graphic, you can see that there's also what's called key mixing that gets focused in. This is where we have a per packet mixing function that helps to add some additional complexity to the process of the system being involved. So as we have encryption being done on the left, and then in the upper and right areas we have data that is being properly fragmented, check streamed, and then being mixed into the algorithm. We're then able to fire off the appropriate ciphertext at the end, whereas previously it would have been far fewer informations being included. We would go from an IV being generated in the key store to a packet, whereas here we have what's called a TSC, which is an IV and an EIV being mixed in as part of this in the ciphertext there. So again, just a secondary component that helps to improve the complexity of the transmission. Better hardware, better encryption. Some other things we would see would be 802.11i. This is an amendment specifically for security mechanisms for 802.11. Radius is central authentication and authorization. We talked about that just a moment ago. Incorporates CHAP, or challenge handshake authentication. TACACS is terminal access controller, access control system. A little redundant, but there you are. Slightly older AAA protocol, gets used in Radius a lot. Kerberos also is going to be a newer instantiation of these. CCMP, which is the counter mode cipher block chaining message authentication code protocol, or CBC MAC protocol. It's super complex. It shouldn't be, but there's a lot going on. So when we talked about the Galois counter mode just a bit ago, this is a similar idea to where we have incremental staging as well as challenge codes that are able to enhance the resilience of a system trying to be replayed or similar. People trying to take existing known good messages and replay them or use them to craft a potentially new good message to bypass the encryption. EAP, extensible authentication, supports multiple authentication methods like tokens, Kerberos tickets, or certs. LEAP is the Cisco proprietary model. PEEP is a TLS encrypted one. TKIP is temporal key integrity protocol, which means that it's going to renegotiate the key after X number of transactions in order to make sure that people do not have enough time to try and brute force what the authentication key is for that particular conversation. And then AES uses symmetric key encryption and is considered an upgrade to TKIP. So we've covered a lot in the last 45 minutes. We've talked about basic wireless security, some technologies that we see quite a bit, like Bluetooth, various iterations of Wi-Fi. We've looked at security issues that are focused on these communication technologies, threats to networks overall, especially at points where we're talking about bridges between wired and non-wired segments, things that are a little bit harder to defend. Tools, of course, that we're likely to come across, and how to protect wireless networks. So thank you guys, as per usual, for your time and attention. I certainly appreciate you. If you have any questions, of course, you can message me through Blackboard, through my campus email, through my Google Voice number, or you can call me in the office, or just come on by. Look forward to seeing you in case you want to come by and just have a chitty chat about various things in security. I'm always glad to see students getting excited and getting involved with the material. So if you have any issues that you would like to address with me, please do so. Please let me know. Make sure I'm doing my job here, giving you guys the info that you need to be successful. So thank you again. Appreciate you all so much, and I will talk to you next time.